Okay, so today we're looking at how LLMs, those large language models everyone's talking about, are actually being used to tackle some pretty complex scientific problems. It's a really interesting area, and we've got a fantastic starting point with this recent blog post from Google Research. They highlight 3 research papers that give us a really good insight into this.
Yeah, and for anyone listening who's really keen on keeping up with the latest advancements in AI and especially how these models are being applied to science, this is a great way to get a grasp of some of the most current research going on. Think of it like, a shortcut to understanding how these LLMs are being evaluated in all sorts of scientific fields. Basically, they break down the key findings of that blog post, focus on those 3 papers, and really try to see what they tell us about how well the current LLMs can handle these scientific challenges.
Yeah. So it's not just like, can it answer a simple question? It's about, can it actually reason like a scientist would? Mm-hmm. Can it handle complex data? Can it even use the tools that scientists use? The Google Research post walks us through 3 distinct research efforts. So each one's kind of using a different lens to assess what LLMs can do. So we'll look at how they do on tasks, like, reasoning with a ton of information. We'll see them tackling some complex simulations. It's a really fascinating mix of how researchers are testing these models. It seems like they're looking at a few things like the ability to reason with lots of information, using the tools scientists actually use, and even understanding how these models might help us understand, the most complex intelligence system of all the human brain.
Yeah, I think that's what's so interesting here. It's not just about answering a question, but can they actually understand and apply scientific principles? And it's really exciting to see that ambition reflected in these evaluations.
So let's get into it. The first paper they highlight, they call it QUA. What's the deal with TU?
So Curie, it's a brand new benchmark, basically a way to test how good LLMs are at scientific reasoning, but with a twist. It focuses on those really long pieces of text you find in actual scientific papers. So it's not just snippets or abstracts, it's the real deal.
Wow. Using real scientific literature. That sounds like a serious step up in difficulty, compared to some of those more standard benchmarks out there. What are they actually feeding into these models?
Well, this Curie data set, it's got this huge variety of tasks, all requiring the model to understand really long pieces of text, and it covers 6 different scientific disciplines. You've got things like density functional theory, which is fundamental to material science, quantum error correction codes, super important for quantum computing, protein sequence reconstruction, that's in biology, then there's geospatial analysis, Hartree-Fock derivation, that's in physics and chemistry, material property value extraction, and even biodiversity georeferencing. The average length of the text these models have to work with, it's about 15,000 words, so we're talking full-on research papers here.
15,000 words. That is a lot of information to process. It seems like Curie is really pushing the boundaries of what we consider long context for these models. How does it actually compare to, some of the other benchmarks that we've seen for LLMs, especially in science?
Right, that's a really good point. A lot of the existing benchmarks, when you're testing NLP on science, they often focus on shorter chunks like abstracts or just individual sentences. Even some of the newer LLM benchmarks that do include science, like GPQA, which is general purpose question answering, or MMLU, that's massive multitask language understanding, they usually stick with short questions and multiple choice answers. What sets Curie apart is that it really focuses on the scientific domain, and it uses these naturally long contexts, just like what scientists actually deal with when they're reading papers. There are other long context benchmarks out there, but they might pull data from lots of different areas or even use artificially created data to test length. Curie is all about the complexity of actual scientific papers.
Okay, so it's a tough benchmark. It's using real science papers. How did the LLMs actually do on it?
Right, so they put 8 different state-of-the-art models to the test. Some were open weight and some were closed weight, but all of them were able to handle context windows of at least 32,000 tokens. That's tens of thousands of words. Among the closed models, Gemini Flash 2.0 and Claude 3, they both consistently did well across all 6 of those scientific disciplines. And then on the open model side, Command R Plus was kind of the standout. It performed pretty well overall.
It's interesting to see those closed models doing so well. Were there any particular areas where the models, kind of struggled as a group? Any consistent weaknesses that emerged?
Yeah, there were definitely some sticking points. Those materials tasks, the ones where the models had to really dig into the text, find information that's maybe spread out, and then put it all together into a coherent answer. Those were tough for all the models. This suggests that even though they're getting better at processing long texts, actually understanding and then synthesizing information across those texts is still a major challenge. The performance on these tasks kind of highlights a limitation. They can process a lot of text, but pinpointing and extracting those specific data points that are scientifically relevant, that's still hard for them.
And were there any surprises when you looked at the individual models, like anything that really stood out in terms of unexpected strengths or weaknesses?
Oh, definitely. So GPT-4o, which actually did pretty well on most of the Chiari tasks, totally bombed on the protein sequencing task. It just got stuck in this loop, kept generating the same sequence over and over again, and that led to a really low score. And what's interesting is that other open weight models, they had that same repetition issue on that task too. On the plus side, Gemini Flash 2.0, the newer one, it actually managed to generate the correct Python code to solve the protein sequencing problem about half the time. But even then, it also had trouble, actually listing the complete sequence in some of its attempts.
Yeah, repetition in a scientific task like protein sequencing, that could lead to totally meaningless results.
Yeah.
It sounds like even those top models still have those weird quirks, which is interesting. The researchers must have had a pretty specific way to judge how well the LLMs did, especially with such a variety of tasks and output formats. How did they actually evaluate the performance?
Yeah, because of the wide range of tasks and the complexity of the expected answers, they actually used a few different evaluation methods. The main approach was what's called zero-shot prompting. So basically, they gave the models the task description and the scientific text, but no examples of how to solve it, kind of like a real-world scenario. And then for the structured outputs, like those lists of dictionaries that came up a lot in tasks where they had to extract things like material properties, they actually developed this new model-based metric called LLM-SIM. See, the traditional ways of evaluating text output just by comparing words, that doesn't work well when you're dealing with complicated scientific data. You need something that understands the meaning and the structure of that information. That's where LLM-SIM and LMN score come in.
So LLM-SIM, it sounds like it's designed to make those comparisons a lot more nuanced, right? It's not just about checking for exact word matches. How does that actually work?
So LLM-SIM, it tries to match up those predicted dictionaries with the actual correct dictionaries. And for each field within those dictionaries, it looks at how similar the predicted value is to the true value. And then, based on those similarities, it figures out the best possible match between the predictions and the ground truth. And then it uses that to calculate things like precision, recall, and F1 score, giving you an overall idea of how well the model found the correct information and put it in the right format.
So it's not just about, whether the words are exactly the same, but about whether that underlying information is right and structured correctly.
Exactly. And the paper also mentions another model-based approach. They call it LM score. They talk more about that in an appendix. Basically, they use another LLM, in this case, GPT-4o, to judge whether the predictions line up with the ground truth, and it gives a score on a 3-point scale. And the cool thing is they weight that score based on how confident the judging model is in its assessment. Oh, and one more thing. They compared LLM-SIM to evaluations done by actual human experts in those scientific fields, and they found a really good agreement, especially for those information retrieval tasks like extracting structures and DFT parameters. So it seems like LM-SIM is a pretty solid tool for automatically evaluating that kind of scientific data.
All right, to really get a feel for what these models were up against, can we dive into some of those specific tasks in Curie? Give us some concrete examples.
Sure, let's start with the density functional theory tasks, or DFT. So they broke this down into 3 parts. DFTS, which was all about figuring out the input structures of the materials being studied. DFTP focused on extracting those specific parameters used in the DFT calculations. And then DFTC, this is where the LLM had to actually write Python code to reproduce those calculations. To do this well, you need a good understanding of how materials are modeled at the quantum level. Plus, you got to find all that information that might be scattered throughout the paper and then, combine it all, sometimes even turn it into code. The fact that these tasks were checked by PhD experts in DFT, that really tells you how complex they are. One of the big things those DFT tasks showed was that even the advanced models, they have a hard time pulling together information that's spread out in a long paper and then using that to do complex multi-step reasoning, especially code generation.
Extracting those structures and parameters, then writing code for the calculations, that's a pretty comprehensive test. What other tasks were particularly interesting or challenging?
Another one that stands out is the error correction zoo task. They call it QECC. So the Error Correction Zoo, it's an open source project that's basically like a catalog of error correcting codes that are used in all sorts of things, from telecommunications to quantum computing. And for this benchmark, the task was to take a research paper that describes a specific error correcting code, and then the LLM had to generate a YAML file, which is basically an entry for that code in the zoo. You need a really deep understanding of that code to do this well. Its properties, all the technical details, the parameters, how it relates to other codes. This benchmark used codes from 65 different papers, and it was curated by experts, so it really emphasized how much specialized knowledge you need for each entry.
So it's not just summarizing, it's really about pulling out those specific bits of information and formatting it correctly. That's quite a challenge.
Absolutely. And then lastly, there's the protein sequence reconstruction task, or PDB. In this one, they give the LLM the 3D coordinates of a protein in that protein data bank format, but they remove all the usual annotations. And the challenge is for the LLM to rebuild the protein's amino acid sequence using just that 3D structure. It forces the LLM to really understand the structural patterns in proteins to figure out that sequence. They used 64 different protein structures for this benchmark.
Wow, reconstructing a biological sequence just from the spatial coordinates, that's a whole different kind of reasoning compared to pulling information from text. Cure.ai really seems to cover a wide range of scientific skills. So what's the main takeaway from this first paper for you?
I think the big takeaway from Curie is that while these top-of-the-line LLMs are definitely getting better at dealing with those long scientific texts and doing more complex reasoning, they've still got a way to go. The things that really trip them up are those tasks that require deep information gathering, really understanding specific scientific concepts and generating those structured outputs, especially code. And GPT-4o failing on the protein sequencing because of that repetition issue, that shows us that they can still have some pretty unexpected weaknesses. But overall, I think Curie is a really valuable tool for pushing the development of LLMs specifically for science.
Let's move on to the second paper in that Google Research Post FeeBench. What's the focus of this one?
FeeBench, it takes a totally different approach. It's all about evaluating how well LLMs and also LM agents can do real-world physics reasoning using what's called finite element analysis, or FEA software. And the specific software they used was COMSOL multiphysics.
So interacting with simulation software, that sounds pretty complex. Why is it such a big step? It's like teaching a computer to be a virtual engineer. Pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's a big deal because if LLMs could effectively use simulation software, it could really change the game for automation in engineering and physics. It could combine human reasoning with the precision of those numerical solvers. That means you could potentially create autonomous systems that could tackle really complex real-world problems. And FEA software, like COMSOL, it's crucial for modeling systems that have really intricate geometries and all these different physical phenomena interacting with each other.
So how exactly does FeeBench test those LM's abilities in that area with simulation software?
So what they did was they had the LLMs generate Java API calls, and those are basically the commands that control COMSOL multiphysics. They even went a step further and developed an LLM agent that could interact with the software through that API. It could check the simulation results and then try to improve its solutions over multiple attempts.
An agent that can learn and adapt, that's pretty advanced. What kind of challenges did they encounter in this setup?
Yeah, even with all that, even their most successful strategies, which could generate executable API, calls it pretty good. 88% of the time, none of the LLMs or agents could fully solve any of the problems in the benchmark. That really shows you just how difficult this task is.
88% sounds good, but if it doesn't lead to a correct solution, there's got to be more to it. How did they measure success beyond just getting the code to run?
Right. They had a really comprehensive evaluation approach. And they didn't just check if the code worked. They also looked at the model tree score. That's how closely the LLM's code structure matched the correct structure. They also used a code similarity score to compare the overall code. But probably most importantly, they came up with these physics metrics specifically to look at the accuracy of those physics modeling steps. So things like interface factuality, making sure the LLM was actually using real interfaces from COMSOL, not making things up. Then there was interface feature property recall, which looked at whether the code included all the correct interfaces, features, and their properties. And then feature dimension checked if the spatial dimensions of the features matched up. It wasn't just about the right code, but the right structure, which makes sense because the structure dictates how the simulation actually runs, right?
Yeah, that structure is essential for actually simulating the physics correctly.
Yeah.
And did they also look at how accurate the final simulation results were?
Yep. They use something called target relative error. strict. It measured the accuracy of the final computed value, but only if the LLM could successfully export a result that it considered valid, meaning not a default value or something straight from the problem description. And the error had to be less than 10%. It was a really strict way to see if the LLM truly solved the problem. You know, the fact that some code ran but just spit out a default value, that shows that LLMs can kind of mimic the form of using those tools, but they don't really understand the underlying science enough to set up the simulation correctly.
So with all those different ways to measure performance, what were some of the big takeaways from FedBench?
Well, one of the key findings was that although LLMs are getting pretty good at the high-level syntax of that CumSol API, they often struggled to pick the right specific interface within the software. Sometimes they'd even hallucinate interfaces that didn't exist. What they found was that if they gave the LLMs access to the API documentation and let them interact multiple times, getting feedback along the way, that really improved the executability of the code. So it suggests that not knowing the exact API commands is a big part of the problem.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you don't know the commands, you're bound to make mistakes. Were there any parts of the simulation process that were particularly difficult for them?
Yes, the physics modeling part was consistently the hardest. And here's the interesting thing. Even when they gave the LLMs really explicit step-by-step plans written out in plain language, it didn't always help that much. So it seems like the problem isn't just turning those instructions into code, it's also about making the right decisions when it comes to the physics. But they did find that using an agent-based approach, where you have an evaluator and a corrector that can look up API stuff and find code snippets, that was promising for cutting down on those hallucinated interfaces.
So more interaction, more feedback, that seems to help. Could you give us a concrete example of how one of these problems played out, from the paper?
Yeah, the blog post mentions that the only problem where the LLM managed to export a seemingly valid result, that was a simulation of heat transfer in a cylinder. It actually just gave a default temperature value. So the code worked, but the physics weren't modeled right, and the answer wasn't really from the simulation at all.
That's a good illustration of the difference between code that works and code that actually gets the science right.
Yeah.
So what's the main takeaway for our listeners from the FedBench study?
I'd say the big takeaway is that LLMs are definitely getting better at generating code for complex software like CumSol, but actually mastering those tools to do real physics, that's still a challenge. Things like those interface hallucinations, making the right physics decisions, and bridging that gap between code that works and code that's scientifically sound, those are all areas that need more work. But the fact that giving them API info and using those multi-turn agents with feedback helps, that's really promising for the future.
And finally, the Google research post mentions a third paper called Deciphering Language Processing in the Human Brain Through LLM Representations. That seems to be a bit broader in terms of its scientific focus. How does that connect to evaluating LLMs in science?
Yeah, that one's interesting. It's listed under general science, health and bioscience, natural language processing, and speech processing in the blog post. So just from the title and those categories, it looks like it's all about how those representations that LLMs learn, during their training can actually be used to understand how language works in the human brain.
So it's not just using them to solve problems in those traditional scientific fields, but as a way to study like the foundation of intelligence itself, the human brain.
Exactly. The blog post doesn't really get into the specific results of this paper, but the fact that they included it shows you that LLMs have these broader applications. They're not just for tackling, traditional science problems. They can also offer new ways to explore those fundamental questions in neuroscience and cognitive science.
That's a pretty cool connection. So let's bring it all together. What are the big takeaways from all this, from the Google research post and those three papers? For someone trying to understand where LLMs stand in science right now.
I think we're seeing some really exciting progress. LLMs are getting better at engaging with those complex scientific tasks. And you can see that in the benchmarks like Curie, which really pushes the limits of reasoning with a lot of text, and in those agent-based approaches in FedBench, where they're interacting with that simulation software. But it's important to remember that there are still big challenges, like really understanding a long text and putting all that information together, the specific reasoning you need for different areas of science, consistently generating code that's correct and actually works for simulations, and dealing with those weird quirks like repetition and formatting errors. Those all need to be addressed.
And for our listeners, especially those who are just starting to explore AI and machine learning, why should they be paying attention to this kind of research?
Well, if you're interested in AI and how it might change the way we do science, these papers are a great snapshot of where things stand right now and what the big problems are. Understanding what LLMs can do well and what they struggle with, especially in those demanding scientific contexts, that gives you a good sense of where the technology is headed. It also shows you how important it is to have those rigorous evaluations and benchmarks like Curay and FedBench, because those are what guide progress.
All right, so to wrap things up, here's something to think about. We've talked about some pretty amazing stuff, LLMs doing complex reasoning with huge amounts of text, interacting with scientific tools, and even potentially helping us understand the human brain. What do you think are the most promising directions for using these models to really accelerate scientific discovery? And just as important, what are those big obstacles that we still need to overcome to really unlock their potential in science? Think about how this might affect your own learning in AI and how those advances could impact the science that interests you most. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of LLMs and scientific progress.